Good day, ECO231 students. Welcome to week 4 and the start of chapter 4. We will complete this chapter over 2 weeks. This week you are only meant to cover section 4.1 and 4.2. I will not be posting your typical test your knowledge questions and exercises this week, but rather at the end of the chapter in week 5. So let's get into individual and market demand. Following on from chapter 3 on consumer behavior, we can now analyze our demand for a good. So these are the two sections which we will be covering this week: individual demand and income and substitution effects. So our analysis of demand can continue in the following 6 steps. So each step represents what is covered in the sections of the chapter. So in section 4.1, we will begin by deriving the demand curve for an individual consumer. We will then go on to examine the effect of a price change in more detail. So here we will look at our income and substitution effects. Then we will go on to see how individual demand curves can be put together to give us our market demand curve. From there, you will show how market demand curves can be used to measure the benefits that people or consumers receive from consuming products over and above what the actual expenditures are that they make. So that is where you look at consumer surplus. Then in section 4.5, you will look at network externalities. So that pertains to what happens if someone's demand for a good is dependent on the demands of other people. So you will examine the snob effect and the bandwagon effect. And then lastly, in section 4.6, we'll briefly describe some of the methods that economists use to obtain empirical information about demand. So we are going to continue now with section 4.1 on individual demand. Now, the demand curve follows the consumption choices a person makes when faced with a budget constraint. Remember from chapter 3, section 3.3, the consumer chooses the market basket that lies on the highest indifference curve that touches the budget line. So we are going to continue with our clothing food example, as you can see in figure 4.1. So we begin our analysis by looking at the effect of price changes on consumption. So here we have an individual who must choose how they will allocate their income given the prices of the goods. Now, in this example, in figure 4.1, we are told that the consumer has an income of $20 and consumes at point B initially. The combination of food and clothing at this point is 12 units of food and 4 units of clothing. So at this point, the prices of the goods are such that food costs $1 per unit and clothing costs $2 per unit. So this is the information given to us. We have an income of $20 and the price of food is $1 and the price of clothing is $2, and from that the budget constraint can be constructed and the consumer is at point B on indifference curve U2. So let's just get the values. Right, there you have the quantities: 4 units of clothing and 12 units of food at point B. Now the figure below, part B of figure 4.1, should look very familiar to you. Here you have a demand curve that has been plotted using the information from this price consumption curve, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, if you trace down point B all the way down to G, G is the corresponding point to point B. The difference in this figure here is that for your demand curve analysis, you've got your price of food on your vertical axis and your quantity demanded of food on your horizontal axis. Now, if we look at point G, we know that corresponding to point B it is 12 units of food. And of course, this analysis here only pertains to food. So hence the 12 units there is the same as this point over here because we're looking at the individual demand for food. And we were told that the price per unit of food was $1, right? So there's your 1 point on your demand curve. Now, what you should notice in part A of figure 4.1 is that there are two instances when the price of food in fact changes. Note the price of clothing doesn't change because when there's a change in the budget lines over here, we see that the vertical intercept of clothing remains the same. There's just a pivoting of these budget lines. They either rotate inward or outwards. The price of clothing hasn't changed, nor has income. Income also hasn't changed, only the price of food. So first consider what happens if price increases. So if price increases from $1 for food to $2, we will see that this budget constraint or budget line is going to pivot inward and it becomes more steep. Now, utility is going to be maximized at A on a lower indifference curve. Now, at this price, the consumer now gets 4 units of food and 6 units of clothing. So think about how a price increase would affect your purchasing power. Your purchasing power would, of course, fall. Now look at figure B and find the corresponding point E. Now see, E reflects that higher price of $2 for a unit of food, but a lower quantity demanded for food at 4 units of food. Now lastly, let's consider if there is a decrease in the price of food. So remember here, we had a scenario where the price of food had increased and hence the budget constraint pivoted inward. And from this point, the budget constraint pivots outward, and that could come about as a result of the price of food decreasing. So the price of food becoming cheaper. So now if the price of food is 50 cents or half a dollar, we can see the budget constraint pivots outward and the consumer is now on a higher indifference curve, U3. And at point D, that is the optimal basket where utility is going to be maximized. The consumer now gets 20 units of food and 5 units of clothing. Now, if we trace this point down to our demand curve, that corresponds to point G. Plotting this point for the quantity of food demanded in relation to its price, we have point H. So in figure B, you can see at 50 cents, you have 20 units of food being consumed. Now, points A, B, and D in figure 4.1, part A, those 3 points traced together gives us what is called the price consumption curve. And we'll define that in a moment. And here in figure B, you have your familiar demand curve relating the price of food to the quantity demanded. Now, the price consumption curve, as we saw in the previous slide, is a curve that traces the utility maximizing combinations of the two goods as the price of one good changes. So in our example, we saw the utility maximizing combinations of food and clothing as the change in the price of food occurred. And the points that got traced out was A, B, and D. So that reflected your price consumption curve. And your individual demand curve is now a curve that relates the quantity of a good that a single consumer will buy to its price. That you're familiar with from ECO231. Now, there are two important properties of the demand curve, right? So the individual demand curve has these two properties. The first is the level of utility that can be attained changes as we move along the curve. Now, think about that. So you saw that associated with the different prices, the indifference curve, the consumer reached change, right? So associated with the different prices, the consumer reached a different indifference curve. And that is as the purchasing power changed. Either it increasing if the price fell or decreasing if the price was raised. So the level of utility, to recap this point, that can be attained changes as we move along the demand curve. Then secondly, at every point on the demand curve, the consumer is maximizing utility by satisfying the condition that the marginal rate of substitution of food for clothing equals the ratio of the prices of food and clothing. So whenever the price of food change, the price ratio, that is the price of food to clothing, remember price of good X over the price of good Y, that changed, and the marginal rate of substitution, of course. So as the relative value or price of food falls to clothing, the consumer will buy more of it. So the marginal rate of substitution of food for clothing decreases as we move down the individual demand curve, and that is the second property. Now we will consider income changes. So the first part dealt with price changes, and now we're going to look at income changes. Now, the income consumption curve can be defined as a curve that traces the utility maximizing combinations of two goods, but now as consumers' income changes. In figure 4.2, we are once again using our food and clothing example to illustrate what happens when income changes and the choices the consumer will make, given that the prices of food and clothing are going to remain constant. So in figure A, we still have clothing on the vertical axis and food on the horizontal axis. And the prices of food and clothing is fixed at $1 for food and $2 for clothing. Now from chapter 3, in section 3.2 on budget constraints, you will recall that if income increased while prices of the goods remained constant, then the budget constraint is going to shift outward in a parallel manner. Now, in our example, the consumer is initially on U1, indifference curve U1, at point A. Now, A is the utility maximizing combination of food and clothing when income is $10. And we saw that 4 units of food and 3 units of clothing were purchased at that point. So we can see that would be the combination there. Now, in figure B, you will see that point E matches point A. So with income at $10, and the price of food at $1, the quantity demanded was 4 units of food. Now, D1 is the demand curve for the fixed income of $10 as price is varied. Now, if consumers' income increased to $20 with the price of food and clothing constant, we see a parallel shift of the budget line outward. And the optimal consumption choice is now on U2, a higher indifference curve at point B. Hence, the consumer can get more food, 10 units of food, and more clothing, 5 units of clothing. Again, if income increases to $30, the consumer will choose a utility maximizing combination at D with 16 units of food and 7 units of clothing. Again, on a higher indifference curve U3. So point B and D corresponds to points G and H respectively in figure B. And point G lies on D2 and point H lies on demand curve 3 respectively. Now in figure B, you will see how the demand curves shifts outward as income increased. So the income consumption curve thus traces out. There you can see your income consumption curve. It thus traces out the utility maximizing combinations as income changes. So tracing through A, B, and D. And the income consumption curve you will see is positive. It is upward sloping. Increasing income will cause the demand curves to shift rightward.